History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 7 The End of the Europeans' World. Chapter 3 A New Asia in the Making. Chinese nationalism had in fact done well out of Russian help, even if the CCP had not. Nevertheless, the KMT was left with grave problems and a civil war on its hands at a time when the revolution needed to satisfy mass demands if it was to survive. The split within the revolution was a setback, making it impossible to dispose finally of the warlord problem and, more serious, weakening of anti-foreign front. Pressure from Japan had continued in the 1920s after the temporary relaxation and handing back of Kiao. Its domestic background was changing in an important way. When the wartime economic boom finally ended in 1920, hard times and growing social strains followed, even before the onset of the World Economic Depression. By 1931, half of Japan's factories were idle. The collapse of European colonial markets and the entrenchment of what remained of them behind new tariff barriers had a shattering effect as Japanese exports of manufactures went down by two-thirds. Japan's export outlets on the Asian mainland were now crucial. Anything that seemed to threaten them provoked intense irritation. The position of the Japanese peasant deteriorated too, millions being ruined or selling their daughters into prostitution in order to survive. Grave political consequences were soon manifest, though less in the intensification of class conflict than in the provocation of nationalist extremism. The forces which were to pour into this had for a long time been absorbed in the struggle against the unequal treaties. With those out of the way, a new outlet was needed, and the harsh operation of industrial capitalism in times of depression provided anti Western feeling with the fresh fuel. The circumstances seemed propitious for further Japanese aggression in Asia. The Western colonial powers were clearly on the defensive, if not in full retreat. The Dutch faced rebellions in Java and Sumatra in the 1920s, the French in the Vietnamese revolt in 1930. In both places, there was the sinister novelty of communist help to the nationalist rebels. The British were not in quite such difficulties in India. Yet, although some Englishmen were not yet reconciled to the idea that India must move towards self government, it was by now the proclaimed aim of British policy. In China, the British had already shown in the 1920s that they wanted only a quiet accommodation with the nationalist movement they found hard to assess and not too grave a loss to face. Their Far Eastern policies looked even feebler after economic collapse, which now knocked the stuffing out of the American opposition to Japan. Finally, Russian power too seemed in eclipse after its attempt to influence events in China. Chinese nationalism, on the contrary, had won notable successes, showed no sign to retreat, and was considered to be beginning to threaten the long established Japanese presence in Manchuria. All these factors were present in the calculations made by the Japanese statesmen as the depression depended. Manchuria was the crucial theater. A Japanese presence there went back to 1905. Heavy investment had followed. At first, the Chinese acquiesced, but in the 1920s began to question it, with support from the Russians who foresaw the danger from the Japanese pushing their influence towards Inner Mongolia. In 1929, the Chinese in fact came into conflict with the Russians over control of the railway, which ran across Manchuria and was the most direct route to Vladivostok. But this can only have impressed the Japanese with the new vigor of Chinese power. The nationalist KMT was reasserting itself in the territories of the old empire. There had been armed conflict in 1928 when the Japanese had tried to prevent KMT soldiers from operating against warlords in North China, whom they found it convenient to patronize. Finally, the Japanese government was by no means unambiguously in control of on the spot. Effective power in Manchuria rested with the commanders of the Japanese forces there, and when in 1931 they organized an incident near Mukden, which they used as an excuse for taking over the whole province, those in Tokyo who wished to restrain them could not do so. There followed the setting up of a new puppet state, Manchukuo, to be ruled by the last Manchu emperor, and an outcry at the League of Nations against Japanese aggression, assassinations in Tokyo, which led to the establishment there of a government much more under military influence, and the expansion of the quarrel with China. In 1932, the Japanese replied to Chinese boycott of their goods by landing forces at Shanghai. In the following year, they came south across the Great Wall to impose a peace which left Japan dominating a part of historic China itself and trying unsuccessfully to organize a secessionist North China. Their matters stood until 1937. The KMT government thus proved unable, after all, to resist imperialist aggression. Yet, from its new capital, Nanking, it appeared to control successfully all save a few border areas. It continued to whittle away at the treaties of inferiority and was helped by the fact that, as the Western powers saw in it a means of opposing communism in Asia, they began to show themselves somewhat more accommodating. These achievements, considerable though they were, nonetheless masked important weaknesses which compromised the KMT's domestic success. The crux was that, though the political revolution might have continued, the social revolution had come to a stop. Intellectuals withdrew their moral support from a regime which had not provided reforms, of which a need to do something about land was the most pressing. The peasants had never given the KMT their allegiance, as some of them had given it to the communists. Unfortunately for the regime, Chiang fell back more and more at this juncture upon direct government through his officers and showed himself increasingly conservative at a time when the traditional culture had decayed beyond repair. The regime was tainted with corruption in the public finances, often at the highest level. The foundations of the new China were therefore insecure, and there was once more a rival waiting in the wings. The central leadership of the CCP for some time continued to hope for urban insurrection. In the provinces, nonetheless, individual communist leaders continued to work along the lines indicated by Mao in Hunan. They dispossessed absentee landlords and organized local Soviets, a shrewd appreciation of the value of the traditional peasant hostility to central government. By 1930, they had done better than this by organizing an army in Jiangxi, where a Chinese Soviet Republic ruled 50 million people, or claimed to. In 1932, the CCP leadership abandoned Shanghai to join Mao in his sanctuary. KMT efforts were now directed towards destroying the Communist army, but always without success. This meant fighting on a second front at a time when Japanese pressure was strongest. The last great KMT effort, it is true, drove the communists out of their sanctuary, thus forcing them on the long march to Shenxi, which began in 1934, the epic of the Chinese Revolution and an inspiration ever since. Once there, the 7,000 survivors found local communist support but were still hardly safe. Only the demands of resistance to the Japanese prevented the KMT from doing more to harass them. Consciousness of the external danger explains why there were tentative essays in cooperation between the CCP and the KMT, again in the later 1930s. They owed something too to another change in the policies of the Comintern. It was an era of popular fronts elsewhere which allied communists with other parties. The KMT was also obliged to mute its anti Western line, and this won it a certain amount of easy sympathy in England and, above all, the United States. But neither the cooperation of the communists nor the sympathies of the Western liberals could prevent the nationalist regime from being forced on the defensive when the Japanese launched their attack in 1937. The China incident, as the Japanese continued to call it, was to take 8 years fighting and inflict grave social and physical damage on China. It has been seen as the opening of the Second World War. At the end of 1937, the Chinese government removed itself for safety's sake to Chongqing in the far west, while the Japanese occupied all the important northern and coastal areas. League condemnation of Japan and Russian deliveries of aircraft seemed equally unable to stem the onslaught. The only bonus in the first black years was an unprecedented degree of patriotic unity in China. Communists and nationalists alike saw that the national revolution was at stake. This was the view of the Japanese too. Significantly, in the area they occupied, they encouraged the re establishment of Confucianism. Meanwhile, the Western powers felt deplorably unable to intervene. Their protests, even on behalf of their own citizens, were when they were menaced and manhandled, were brushed aside by the Japanese, who by 1939 made it clear that they were prepared to blockade the foreign settlements if recognition of the Japanese new order in Asia was not forthcoming. For British and French, weakness there was an obvious explanation. They had troubles enough elsewhere. American ineffectiveness had deeper roots. It went back to a long established fact that, however, the United States might talk about the mainland Asia, Americans would not fight for it, perhaps wisely. When the Japanese bombed and sank an American gunboat near Nanking, the State Department huffed and puffed but eventually swallowed Japanese explanations. It was all very different from what had happened to the USS Maine in Havana Harbor 40 years before, though the Americans did send supplies to Chiang Kai shek. By 1941, China was all but cut off from the outside world, though on the eve of rescue. At the end of that year, its struggle would at last be merged with the World War. By then, though China had been badly damaged. In the long duel between the potential Asian rivals, Japan was by then clearly the winner. On the debit side of Japan's account had to be placed the economic cost of the struggle and the increasing difficulty experienced by its occupying forces in China. On the other hand, its international position had never seemed stronger. This was demonstrated by humiliating Western residents in China and by forcing the British in 1940 to close the Burma Road by which supplies reached China, and the French to admit an occupying army to Indochina. Here was a temptation to further adventure, and it was not likely to be resisted while the prestige of the military and their power in government remained as high as it had been since the mid 1930s. Yet there was also a negative side to this. Aggression made it more and more imperative for Japan to seize the economic resources of Southeast Asia and Indonesia. Yet it was also slowly preparing the Americans psychologically for armed defense of their interests. It was clear by 1941 that the United States would have to decide before long whether it was to be an Asian power at all and what that might mean. In the background, though, lay something even more important. For all its aggression against China, it was with the window dressing slogan of Asia for the Asians that Japan advanced on the crumbling Western position in Asia. Just as its defeat of Russia in 1905 marked an epoch in the psychological relations of Europe and Asia. So did the independence and power which Japan showed in 1938 to 1941. When followed by the overthrow of the European empires, as it was to be, it would signal the beginning of the era of decolonization, thus fittingly inaugurated by the one Asian power at that time successful in its westernization. Chapter 4: The Ottoman Heritage and the Western Islamic Lands. During the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire all but disappeared in Europe and Africa. In each continent, the basic causes were the same: the disintegrating effect of nationalism and the predatory activities of European powers. The Serbian Revolt of 1804 and the Mehmet Ali's establishment of himself as the governor of Egypt in 1805 together opened the final, though long drawn out, era of Turkish decline. In Europe, the next milestone was the Greek Revolt. From that time, the story of the Ottoman Empire in Europe can be told in the dates of the establishment of the new nations until in 1914. Turkey in Europe meant only eastern Thrace. In Islamic Africa, the decline of the Ottoman power had by then gone even further and faster. Much of North Africa had already been virtually independent of the Sultan's rule early in the 19th century. One result was that when nationalism began to appear in Islamic Africa, it tended to be directed more against Europeans than against the Ottomans. It was also linked with the cultural innovation. The story again begins with the Mehmet Ali. Though he himself never went further west than his birthplace, Kavala, in Rumelia, he admired European civilization and thought Egypt could learn from it. He imported technical instructors, employed foreign councils in the direction of health and sanitation measures, printed translations of European books and papers on technical subjects, and sent boys to study in France and England. Yet he was working against the grain. His practical achievements disappointed him, though he opened Egypt to European, especially French influence as never before. Much of it flowed through educational and technical institutions and reflected an old French interest in the trade and affairs of the Ottoman Empire. French, French was soon the second language of educated Egyptians, and a large French community grew up in Alexandria, one of the great cosmopolitan cities of the Mediterranean. Few modernizing statesmen in the non European world had been able to confine their borrowings from the West to technical knowledge. Soon, young Egyptians began to pick up political ideas too. There were plenty of those available in French. A compost was forming which would, in the end, help to transform Europe's relations with Egypt. Egyptians would draw the same lessons as Indians, Japanese, and Chinese. The European disease had to be caught in order to generate the necessary antibodies against it. So, modernization and nationalism became inextricably intertwined. Here lay the origin of an enduring weakness in Middle Eastern nationalism. It was long to be the creed of advanced elites cut off from a society whose masses lived in an Islamic culture, still largely uncorroded by Western ideas. Paradoxically, the nationalists were usually the most Europeanized members of Egyptian, Syrian, and Lebanese societies, and this was true until well into the 20th century. Yet their ideas were to come to have wider resonance. It was among Christian Arabs of Syria that there seems first to have appeared the idea of pan Arabian or Arab nationalism, as opposed to Egyptian, Syrian, or some other kind, an assertion that all Arabs, wherever they were, constituted a nation. Pan Arabism was an idea distinct from that of the Brotherhood of Islam, which not only embraced millions of non Arabs but also excluded many non Muslim Arabs. The potential complications of this for any attempt actually to realize an Arab nation in practice were like other weaknesses of pan Arabist ideas, not to appear until well into the 20th century. Another landmark in the history of former Ottoman lands was the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. This did more in the long run, though indirectly, than any other single fact to doom Egypt into intervention by foreigners. Yet the canal was not the immediate cause of the start of the 19th century interference by Europeans in Egypt's government. That came about because of the actions of Ismail, the first ruler of Egypt to obtain from the Sultan the title of Khedive in recognition of his substantial de facto independence. Educated in France, Ismail liked Frenchmen and up to date ideas and traveled much in Europe. He was very extravagant. When he became ruler in 1863, the price of cotton, Egypt's main export, was high because of American Civil War, and Ismail's financial prospects therefore looked good. Unhappily, his financial management was less than orthodox. The results were to be seen in the rise in the Egyptian national debt. 7 million pounds at Ismail's accession. It stood at nearly 100 million only 13 years later. The interest charges amounted to 5 million a year in an age when such sums mattered. In 1876, the Egyptian government was bankrupt and ceased to pay its debts, so foreign managers were sent in. Two controllers, one British, one French, were appointed to make sure that Egypt was governed by Ismail's son, with the priority of keeping up revenue and paying off the debt. They were soon blamed by nationalists for the huge burdens of taxation laid upon the Egyptian poor in order to provide the revenue to pay debt, interest, as well as for economies such as the reduction of the government salaries. The European officials who worked in the name of the Khedive were, in the nationalists' eyes, simply the agents of foreign imperialism. There was growing resentment of the privileged legal position of the many foreigners in Egypt and their special courts. These grievances led to nationalist conspiracy and eventually to revolution. As well as the westernizing xenophobes, there were others now urging the reform of Islam, the unity of the Muslim world, and a pan Islamic movement adapted to modern life. Some were simply antagonized by the preponderance of Turks in the Khedive's entourage. But such divisions mattered less after a British intervention frustrating a revolution in 1882. This was not intervention for financial reasons. It took place because British policy, even under a liberal prime minister who favored nationalisms in other part of the Ottoman Empire, could not accept the danger that the security of the canal route to India might be jeopardized by an unfriendly government at Cairo. It was unthinkable at the time, but British soldiers were only at last to leave Egypt in 1956, tied down until then as they were by strategical dogma. After 1882, therefore, the British became the prime targets of nationalist hatred in Egypt. They said they wanted to withdraw as soon as a dependable government was available, but could not do so because none was acceptable to them. Instead, British administrators took on more and more of government of Egypt. This was not wholly deplorable. They reduced the debt and mounted irrigation schemes. which made it possible to feed a growing population. It doubled to about 12 million between 1880 and 1914. They antagonized Egyptians, though, by keeping them out of government service in the interests of economy, by imposing high taxes, and by being foreign. After 1900, there was growing unrest and violence. The British and the puppet Egyptian government proceeded firmly against agitation and also sought ways out through reform. At first, administrative this led in 1913 to a new constitution providing for more representative elections to a more powerful legislative assembly. Unfortunately, the assembly met only for a few months before it was suspended at the outbreak of war. The Egyptian government was pushed into war with Turkey. A Khedive suspected of anti British plotting was replaced, and at the end of the year, the British proclaimed a protectorate. The Khedive now took the title of Sultan. By then, the Ottoman government had also lost Tripolitania to the Italians, who had invaded it in 1911, partly because of another manifestation of reforming nationalism, this time in Turkey itself. In 1907, a successful rebellion had been started there by Young Turk movement, which had a complicated history but a simple purpose. As one Young Turk put it, we follow the path traced by Europe, even in our refusal to accept foreign intervention. The first part of this meant that they wished to end the despotic rule of Abdul Hamid and restore a liberal constitution granted in 1876 and subsequently withdrawn. But they wanted this less for its own sake than because they thought it would revive and reform the empire, making possible modernization and an end to the process of decay. Both this program and the Young Turks' method of conspiracy owed much to Europe. They used, for example, Masonic lodges as cover and organized secret societies such as those which had flourished among European liberals in the days of the Holy Alliance. But they much resented the increasing interference in Ottoman internal affairs by the Europeans, notably in the management of finances. For, as in Egypt, the securing of interest on money lent for internal development had been followed by the loss of independence. European bullying had also resulted, they felt, in the Ottoman government's long and humiliating retreat from the Danube Valley and the Balkans. After a series of mutinies and revolts, the Sultan gave way over the constitution in 1908. Liberals abroad smiled on constitutional Turkey. It seemed that misrule was at last to end, but an attempted counter revolution led to a Young Turk coup, which disposed Abdul Hamid and installed a virtual dictatorship. From 1909 to 1914, the revolutionaries ruled with increasingly dictatorial means from behind the facade of constitutional monarchy. Ominously, one of them announced that there are no longer Bulgars, Greeks, Romanians, Jews, Muslims. We glory in being Ottoman. This was something quite new. The announcement of the end of the old multinational regime. With hindsight, the Young Turks seem more comprehensible than they did at the time. They faced problems like those of many modernizers in non European countries, and their violent methods have been emulated by many since from necessity or imagined necessity. They threw themselves into reform of every branch of government, importing many European advisors. To seek, for instance, to improve the education of girls was a significant gesture in an Islamic country, but they took power in an empire displaying blatant signs of backwardness, enduring a shattering succession of diplomatic humiliations, which weakened their appeal and led them to rely on force. After the Habsburg annexation of Bosnia, the ruler of Bulgaria won an acknowledgement of Bulgarian independence, and the Cretans announced their union with Greece. A brief pause then was followed by the Italian attack on Tripoli, and then the Balkan Wars and further military defeat.